Flight attendant hits black woman. Instantly fired upon discovering who she is. Have you ever been on a flight where the unthinkable happens? A peaceful journey turns into a shocking event no one saw coming. In this incredible story, one woman's simple request led to an outrageous confrontation with a flight attendant, right in front of stunned passengers. But the twist that follows will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out what happened next, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to never miss stories that inspire, surprise, and make you think.
It all began like any other ordinary flight. Passengers hustling down the aisles, finding their seats, stowing luggage, and preparing for a long journey ahead. The plane was minutes away from taking off, and the flight attendants were doing their usual pre-flight routine. Among the crowd, however, one woman stood out. A teacher named M. Jackson, traveling from New York to California to attend an education conference. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a professional yet comfortable outfit, her eyes scanning the aisle as she made her way to her seat. For months, she had been looking forward to this trip, eager to gain new insights and ideas to bring back to her classroom. It was going to be an exciting experience, but what came next was beyond anything she could have prepared for. As the plane taxied down the runway, Miss Jackson settled into her seat, adjusting her recliner to get more comfortable. She had been dealing with back pain from a recent injury, and she figured a little adjustment would help. But as she leaned back, she quickly realized she wasn't going to get the comfort she needed. So she politely called for the flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s, with a stern look on her face, who was making her way down the aisle. "Excuse me," Miss Jackson said, her tone calm and courteous. "Could you please adjust the seat a bit? I'm having some back pain." At first, the flight attendant seemed understanding. She nodded and started toward Miss Jackson's seat. But then, something changed. Maybe it was the stress of the job. Maybe it was just a bad day. But instead of helping, the attendant's expression hardened. She stared at Miss Jackson coldly and said, "This is how it is. You'll have to deal with it." Miss Jackson was taken aback, but didn't let it show. Trying to stay patient, she asked again, "I understand, but could you please make it just a little more comfortable?" "It's just a small adjustment." The flight attendant's response was sharp and unfeeling. "You should have thought about that before you booked the seat." For a moment, the tension between them hung in the air, but it didn't seem like anything more than a small disagreement. Passengers were still settling in, oblivious to what was unfolding. But just as Miss Jackson was about to say something else to diffuse the situation, the unthinkable happened. Without warning, the flight attendant leaned in and slapped Miss Jackson across the face. The sound of the slap reverberated through the cabin. It was like time stopped. Passengers froze, looking up from their seats, some wide-eyed in disbelief, others open-mouthed in shock. The slap echoed, and the entire plane went silent. Miss Jackson, her hand instinctively reaching for her cheek, slowly stood up. There was a moment of pure stillness. She was trying to process what had just happened, still in shock at the audacity of the flight attendant. No one expected this. No one could have predicted that this would be the turning point. The slap wasn't just physical. It was a complete violation of respect, of basic decency, and it left everyone around her frozen in stunned silence. The passengers, caught in the middle, were unsure of how to react. Some glanced nervously at each other, unsure if they should intervene or stay quiet. Others quickly turned away, pretending they hadn't seen a thing, hoping to avoid the tension. But Miss Jackson didn't flinch. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. Instead, her voice was calm but resolute as she spoke. "I want to speak to the captain." The flight attendant, clearly taken aback by the firm response, tried to dismiss it. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said, brushing it off as though it were no big deal. But the damage had already been done. Miss Jackson was not backing down. She stood tall and walked calmly toward the front of the plane. The flight attendant watched her with a look of disbelief, but there was nothing she could do. The tension in the air was growing thicker by the second. Passengers were now murmuring among themselves, whispering about the shocking incident. Some were sympathetic toward Miss Jackson, while others were angry on her behalf. But no one seemed to know exactly what to do. When Miss Jackson reached the cockpit door, she knocked firmly. The captain, a man in his 50s with a serious demeanor, opened the door and listened attentively. He didn't interrupt as Miss Jackson explained what had happened. How the flight attendant slapped her in front of the entire plane. After a moment of silence, the captain stood up and walked toward the main cabin. Minutes passed, but to Miss Jackson, it felt like hours. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Everyone was waiting for the next move. Whispers grew louder. What would happen now? Would the flight attendant face any consequences? And how would the rest of the flight play out? Then the captain returned. His presence commanded immediate attention as he walked down the aisle. He didn't hesitate for a second. His gaze was focused, his demeanor stern. As he reached Miss Jackson, he turned to the flight attendant, who was now looking visibly uneasy. "You need to come with me," the captain said, his voice firm, without room for argument. The flight attendant's face flushed with embarrassment. She knew the eyes of the entire plane were on her now. She had miscalculated, thinking her position would shield her from any real repercussions. But now reality hit. She was about to face the consequences of her actions. "Is everything okay?" One of the passengers asked Miss Jackson softly, her concern evident. Miss Jackson turned toward her with a small nod. "It will be," she replied quietly, her voice calm yet holding a strength that was impossible to ignore. As the flight attendant was escorted off the plane, passengers exchanged glances, some still unsure of what had just unfolded. The captain returned to the front of the plane and made an announcement over the intercom. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of authority in it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we regret to inform you that due to an unforeseen situation, we are unable to continue with the current crew member. We are making arrangements for a replacement, and we appreciate your understanding as we handle this matter." Miss Jackson's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected the captain to be so direct, but as the reality of the situation sank in, she couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. The flight attendant had crossed a line, and now she was facing the consequences. As the captain disappeared once again to deal with the aftermath, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. What would happen next? Would the flight attendant return? And how would the rest of the flight unfold? For Miss Jackson, the journey was far from the relaxing trip she had hoped for, but at least in that moment, she stood tall. The minutes stretched on as she sat quietly in her seat, replaying the events in her mind. The slap, the way the flight attendant reacted, and the sheer disrespect. It was as if the entire situation had spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye. Around her, passengers whispered, some recalling similar experiences, others exchanging glances filled with sympathy. But no one seemed ready to speak up. Then, as if the tension couldn't build any further, the captain reappeared, this time with a younger flight attendant. Her face was apologetic and kind as she made her way to the front of the plane. The original flight attendant was nowhere to be seen. She had been escorted off the plane, never to return. And with that, the atmosphere slowly began to shift. The drama was far from over. But one thing was clear. The flight had changed forever. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind of weight that makes it feel as though the entire world is watching. Miss Jackson could feel the stares of the passengers on her as if they were all silently trying to process the chaos they had just witnessed. Some still exchanged looks of confusion. Others appeared uncertain whether they should offer comfort or stay out of it. Despite it all, Miss Jackson remained composed, staring out of the window, trying to steady her breathing and gathering her thoughts. The new flight attendant, trying to restore a semblance of calm, walked down the aisle and made an effort to reassure the passengers. Her voice was soft, but there was an underlying authority in her tone. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your new flight attendant for the remainder of this journey. My goal is to ensure that the rest of your flight is smooth and comfortable. If there's anything I can assist with, please don't hesitate to ask." Her words were professional, but they couldn't quite mask the residual discomfort left by the incident. The passengers were still digesting the shocking turn of events. For Miss Jackson, though she was still visibly shaken by what had happened, there was a slight sense of relief. The immediate threat of further confrontation had passed, and she allowed herself to sink into her seat, taking a deep breath as the plane began its ascent. The hum of the engines became almost deafening, an eerie contrast to the heavy silence that had followed the altercation. She closed her eyes, needing a moment to collect herself, but the weight of the situation pressed on her chest. The sting from the slap had begun to fade, but the emotional impact of the incident lingered, especially the humiliation and the blatant disregard for basic human decency she had experienced. It wasn't just about the slap itself, it was the feeling of being dismissed, belittled in front of a cabin full of strangers. She had never expected to experience such an attack, especially in a setting where she was simply a passenger trying to manage her own discomfort. As the new flight attendant moved through the cabin, distributing snacks and drinks, Miss Jackson could sense the tension in the room was far from dissipated. The quiet murmurs among the passengers told her that they too were still processing the events. Some turned to her with expressions of sympathy, offering small, subtle gestures that reminded her that there was support, even if it wasn't overt. It helped ease the sting a little, but it didn't erase the emotional toll. And then her phone buzzed in her pocket. Miss Jackson hesitated for a moment before checking it, her heart sinking when she saw the message from a friend. "Are you okay? I just saw a video of what happened on the plane." She felt a rush of panic. She didn't need to ask how or why the video had surfaced. She knew exactly how fast things could spread on social media. Within minutes, someone had captured the moment on their phone and uploaded it, setting off a viral storm that no one on board had seen coming. As she opened the message, a link to the video appeared. It was titled, "Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher Over Seat Adjustment," and the thumbnail displayed a blurry image of Miss Jackson, her hand to her cheek, with the flight attendant's silhouette in the background. Her stomach twisted as she clicked the link. The video was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to capture the shock of the moment. Miss Jackson's face was a picture of surprise and disbelief, her reaction raw and unfiltered. She knew, even without watching, that it would spread like wildfire. The comments section exploded almost immediately. Some sided with Miss Jackson, calling out the flight attendant's actions as cruel and unprovoked. Others, however, questioned whether Miss Jackson had been too sensitive or had somehow provoked the situation. She couldn't help but feel a rising tide of anger and frustration. This moment, which had been a deeply personal violation, was now being judged by millions of strangers who had no understanding of the full context. And it wasn't just the passengers or the online community reacting. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the story had already spread to major news outlets. Articles began appearing online with sensationalized headlines: "Shocking Airline Incident, Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher, Overseat Issue and Caught on Camera, the Flight Attendant Who Lost Control." The story was quickly becoming a media spectacle, and Miss Jackson's name was now being linked to an event she never wanted to be part of. She couldn't escape the flood of messages, notifications, and media attention. It felt like the whole world had turned its focus on her, judging her for something she had never intended to be a part of. And the flight attendant? She had become the subject of ridicule, with many people condemning her behavior. Miss Jackson, however, was beginning to see this from a different perspective. This wasn't just an embarrassing incident. It was a moment of reckoning, one that held the potential for something much bigger. She had no control over how the story would unfold or how it would be spun in the media, but she realized that she could control her response. This was no longer just about a slap. It was about how this moment could spark a conversation about respect, authority, and accountability in spaces where people are vulnerable. The plane continued its steady flight, but Miss Jackson knew that the events unfolding now would have ripple effects far beyond this flight. As she sat there, the weight of it all pressed heavily on her chest, but she also knew that she couldn't let this incident define her. She had the power to turn this into something meaningful. Whether that meant speaking out, sharing her side of the story, or using her newfound platform to stand up for others, she wasn't sure yet, but she knew this wasn't the end. The hours on the plane seemed to stretch on endlessly, but the situation continued to evolve. The new flight attendant remained professional, moving through the cabin with an air of quiet authority, but even she couldn't hide the tension that had taken root in the cabin. Despite the attempts to move past the situation, the effects were still visible. Miss Jackson couldn't help but notice the way passengers looked at her, some out of curiosity, others with judgment. The whispers had not stopped. What would happen next? Would the flight attendant return? Would there be consequences for her actions? These questions loomed over the cabin, and the tension was growing. Then, as if on cue, the captain appeared at the front of the cabin. His presence commanded attention as he walked toward Miss Jackson. The passengers fell silent, awaiting what would happen next. His eyes met hers, and without saying a word, he nodded to the new flight attendant, signaling that she should take over. He then turned to Miss Jackson and spoke with calm authority. "We are handling the situation, Miss Jackson. Rest assured, this will be addressed." Though the situation was still unfolding, Miss Jackson couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The captain had taken charge, and in that moment, it seemed like there might be a path forward, a way for this whole ordeal to find some resolution. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this flight, was just the beginning of something much larger. Something that had the power to ignite conversations and bring about change. And Miss Jackson in that moment was ready to take on whatever came next. As Miss Jackson sat in her seat, she could feel the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders. What had started as a simple request, asking the flight attendant to adjust her seat, had spiraled into something much darker, a confrontation that now seemed to dominate the atmosphere around her. It wasn't long before she noticed the ripple effect of the viral video. Passengers a few rows ahead were huddled together, watching the footage on a tablet, their faces a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and shock. Some gave her subtle nods of support, while others seemed unsure of how to even process what was unfolding before them. Miss Jackson felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. Being the center of attention like this, especially for something so humiliating, was not a position she had ever imagined herself in. Yet paradoxically, there was an unexpected sense of empowerment in seeing strangers silently stand with her, their gaze speaking volumes. The flight continued its course, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Miss Jackson couldn't stop herself from replaying the sequence of events in her mind. What had started as a simple request had turned into an explosive altercation. The situation had snowballed into a viral scandal, one that had already started to spread far beyond the walls of the airplane. No one plans for something like this, not in their wildest dreams. Yet here she was, overwhelmed by the attention, as she wondered just how long it would take before things returned to some semblance of normalcy. When the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing an unexpected detour to refuel, Miss Jackson briefly felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was just a technical issue, a normal delay, but within moments she realized the truth. The flight wasn't being delayed for fuel. The real reason was far more significant. An official investigation had been initiated into the incident. A team of airline security personnel, accompanied by a representative from customer service, began making their way down the aisle. They moved with purpose, and their presence immediately commanded attention. Miss Jackson braced herself as they approached her, and one of them spoke with a voice that was professional yet tinged with sympathy. "We deeply regret what you've experienced today," the representative said, his tone both respectful and formal. "We're taking immediate action regarding the flight attendant's behavior, and we'll ensure you're well taken care of for the rest of the flight. We just need to take your statement." While the airline seemed eager to show their support, Miss Jackson couldn't shake the complex emotions brewing inside her. Relief that someone was acknowledging what she had been through, mixed with anger and a sense of disbelief. She had never imagined a simple request could escalate to this. And yet, here she was, the subject of a scandal that had already captured the public's attention. The security team documented every detail of the altercation, every word exchanged between her and the flight attendant. But Miss Jackson knew that no matter how much paperwork was filled out, no amount of official documentation could erase the sting of that slap. As she gave her statement, other passengers were also questioned. Their accounts varied, but the consensus was undeniable. The flight attendant had crossed a line. Some passengers had witnessed Miss Jackson's polite request for a seat adjustment. Others had heard the sharp response from the flight attendant. But it was the slap, the violent act that was caught on camera, that everyone kept coming back to. By the time the questioning was over, Miss Jackson felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and resolve. She had boarded this flight as a teacher, a professional woman, just trying to attend a conference. Now she was at the center of a viral controversy that had the potential to change her life forever. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the mood on board was anything but. The new flight attendants moved with caution, their demeanor subdued. Apologies and reassurances were offered, but Miss Jackson knew deep down that this incident wouldn't be easily forgotten. She had become a symbol of something larger, something that extended far beyond the confines of that aircraft. When the plane finally began its descent toward their destination, Miss Jackson found herself lost in thought. The slap was no longer the focal point. What was unfolding now was a much bigger issue, a conversation about power, accountability, and the rapid way in which a moment could snowball into something that impacted the lives of everyone around her. She had no idea what would come next, but one thing was certain. The story was far from over. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the turbulence she had experienced earlier seemed like a distant memory compared to the emotional storm she was navigating. The noise of the engines did nothing to drown out the noise in her mind as she prepared to step off the plane. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was now a central figure in a controversy that had already captured the public's eye. As she disembarked, she hoped to leave the chaos behind in the sky. But the moment her feet hit the ground, she was met by a small group of airport staff waiting by the jet bridge. Some were in uniform, others were in plain clothes. Their presence was formal, invasive, and their apologetic expressions did little to ease the weight on her chest. "Miss Jackson," one of them said, their voice polite yet distant, "we've arranged for a private space for you to gather your thoughts. We understand this has been an incredibly stressful experience for you." As they escorted her through the terminal, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of others on her. Some passengers who had been on the flight glanced her way, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. It felt as though the whole world had already heard her story, and she hadn't even had the chance to fully process what had happened. Her phone buzzed once more, and when she checked, she was greeted by an avalanche of news alerts. The incident had exploded in the media, with headlines like "Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher in Shocking Viral Video," and articles flooding her notifications. The story wasn't just trending, it had gone mainstream. By the time she was led into the private room, she was already overwhelmed. She sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through social media, the range of public opinion hitting her like a storm. Some defended her, others blamed her for escalating the situation. But what struck her most was how the focus was shifting. Yes, the slap was shocking, but the real conversation was about the behavior of the flight attendant and the airline's role in all of it. People, from activists to ordinary citizens, were demanding answers. Miss Jackson had never expected any of this. She had just wanted a quiet flight, a trip to attend her conference. Now she was at the heart of a conversation that was bigger than herself. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. One of the airline representatives entered, a concerned look on their face. "Miss Jackson," they said softly, "we've arranged for you to be taken to your hotel, but we also understand you may want to speak with our legal team before anything further happens." Legal team, the word sent a chill down her spine. It had gone beyond just a customer service issue. The situation had escalated in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I just want to be left alone for now," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need time to think." The representative nodded and left the room, closing the door behind them. Alone with her thoughts, Miss Jackson stared at the screen of her phone once more. Messages from friends and colleagues flooded in, offering their support. It was comforting, but also overwhelming. She had never imagined her name would be tied to something like this. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over yet. The story had just begun, and she hadn't yet decided what her role in it would be. Then the door clicked open again. This time it wasn't another airline representative. It was a reporter. "Miss Jackson," he said, his voice calm yet determined, "I'm from news outlet, and we'd like to hear your side of the story. Can we talk?" In that moment, Miss Jackson knew her life had changed forever. The story she never wanted was about to take yet another unexpected turn. She sat there, heart pounding, trying to process everything. She had seen this reporter on TV, covering major stories. Now she was part of one. For a brief moment, she considered turning him away, sticking to her decision to stay out of the spotlight. But as she looked at the reporter, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring the truth was told. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We can talk." The reporter smiled, sensing her resolve. His camera crew moved into position, and the weight of the moment became even more tangible. As the interview began, Miss Jackson knew that how she responded here could shape the narrative of everything that was to come. She wasn't sure where it would go, but she knew one thing for certain. It was far from over. Miss Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the entire situation settle in her chest. She had always prided herself on her professionalism and ability to maintain composure. But now, in the aftermath of an incident that had quickly spiraled into something far beyond her control, she found herself unsure of what was coming next. She hesitated again, but this time there was a resolve in her voice as she spoke. "The captain came over and they removed me from the flight. I didn't expect that. I thought maybe there would be some kind of discussion, a chance for everyone to cool down. But no, they acted quickly, too quickly, and apologized to me. But honestly, I'm not sure if that's enough." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The airline's response so far has been, I don't know, reactive, not proactive. They didn't handle it in a way that made me feel heard, or that made me feel like they were taking this seriously from the beginning. I didn't want to be the story, but now that it's out there, I have to make sure this doesn't happen again. To anyone." The reporter nodded, clearly processing her words with careful attention. "Do you think the flight attendant acted out of anger, or was there something else going on that led to this? What do you think triggered her response?" Miss Jackson sat back, feeling the weight of the question. She thought carefully before answering. "I don't know what was going on with her. It felt personal, like something deeper was at play. Maybe she was having a bad day, or maybe it was just that particular moment. But whatever it was, that's not the way to treat anyone. No one should be made to feel less than, not by a colleague, not by anyone. I didn't ask for a fight. I didn't provoke her. I was just asking for a simple adjustment, trying to get some help. But instead of compassion, she chose to respond with violence. And that, I don't care what the reason was. That is never okay." The reporter's face softened slightly, his tone now gentler but no less focused. "So, you think this incident is part of a broader issue, not just an isolated event?" Miss Jackson's mind raced, thoughts of her students and her work suddenly more vivid than ever. She spoke, her voice steady. "It's hard to say for sure, but I do know that this isn't the first time something like this has happened, not just in the airline industry, but in so many places where people in positions of power treat others badly. There are countless stories, some public, many not, of poor customer service, of mistreatment, and of power being misused. And just because it's common doesn't mean it should be accepted. It's not okay, and it should never be ignored. That's what I want to change. I want to help make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The reporter leaned back, clearly impressed by her passion and the clarity in her words. "So, you're calling for accountability?" "Yes," Miss Jackson said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want people to understand that actions have consequences, not just for the person who's harmed, but for the environment that lets it happen. It's about creating a culture of respect. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, across the board, especially when we're in positions of authority." The reporter paused, letting her words sink in before responding. "I think that's a powerful message, Miss Jackson, and I'm sure many people will stand behind you on this. Thank you for sharing your side of the story." As the camera crew began packing up, Miss Jackson sat back in her chair, a deep sense of relief washing over her. She had done it. She had found her voice in the chaos, stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had become part of a much larger conversation. The media storm was just beginning, but for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt like she had a little control over her own narrative. The reporter left, giving her a quick nod before disappearing down the hallway. Miss Jackson was left alone once again, her phone buzzing constantly with messages, some supportive, others questioning, but always demanding something from her. Yet despite the growing cacophony of opinions, Miss Jackson felt a strange sense of calm settle in her. She had spoken her truth, but the quiet in the room was suffocating. The weight of the interview still hung heavy in the air, and Miss Jackson couldn't ignore the reality of what was coming. This was no longer just about the slap. This was about a larger issue, one that had thrust her into the public eye, whether she wanted it or not. She thought about her students, the ones she taught every day. Students who were learning about respect, kindness, and standing up for what's right. She realized that in this moment, she wasn't just representing herself, she was modeling these values in the most unexpected way. As she sat there in the sterile, quiet room, her mind began to sharpen. The storm surrounding her wasn't going away, but maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to turn it into something bigger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the people who had ever been mistreated, ignored, or made to feel small. She could be the catalyst for change, even if she didn't know exactly what that change would look like yet. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see another airline representative standing there, a folder in hand. His face was calm but apologetic. "Miss Jackson," he said, his voice low, "I hope you're doing all right. We've arranged for your hotel accommodations as we discussed earlier. Additionally, our legal team is here if you'd like to discuss any further actions or concerns regarding what happened on the flight." Miss Jackson nodded slowly, her mind still spinning. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling hollow against the gravity of everything she had just endured. Her heart wasn't in the polite formalities anymore. She was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally. As the representative stepped out of the room, Miss Jackson pulled her phone back out, scanning through the hundreds of messages flooding in. Some were supportive, some critical, others just plain hurtful. But amidst the noise, she found the clarity she needed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. She wasn't going to let this become a fleeting headline. It was time to fight for change, and she knew she was ready. The reporter had asked her about accountability, and now she was determined to hold everyone, herself included, to it. The next step was unclear, but one thing was certain. Miss Jackson wasn't backing down. We treat one another, especially in moments where patience and empathy are required the most. It's about the way we respond to frustration, the way we value, or fail to value, basic human dignity in our interactions. And it's about the systems that allow such behavior to persist unchecked. Miss Jackson paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent now, the audience fully engaged. "In my case, the flight attendant's actions were extreme," she continued. "But ask yourself, how often have you seen or experienced something similar? Maybe not a slap, but a dismissive comment, an unkind word, a refusal to help when help was needed. It happens in classrooms, boardrooms, restaurants, hospitals, and airplanes. It happens in every walk of life. And when it does, it chips away at something essential, our sense of respect for one another." The audience nodded in quiet agreement, some leaning forward in their seats. "Let me be clear," she said firmly. "This isn't about shaming individuals. It's about asking how we, as a society, can do better. How can we create environments where respect isn't an afterthought, but the foundation, where no one, regardless of their role or title, feels like their dignity can be disregarded?" Miss Jackson stepped away from the podium for a moment, walking across the stage to connect more personally with the audience. "When I was slapped, it wasn't just my face that stung. It was my pride, my sense of self-worth. And I've realized that what hurt most wasn't just the act itself, but the underlying message it sent. You don't matter. That's why I'm standing here today, not to relive the moment, but to ask all of you, especially as leaders, educators, and professionals, to think deeply about how we can change that message." She returned to the podium and glanced at her notes before continuing, her voice rising with conviction. "This is a call to action. Respect isn't optional. It's foundational. It's not just a policy in an employee handbook. It's a practice that must be lived every single day. And it starts with us. It starts in our classrooms, in our offices, in our homes. It starts in how we speak to one another, how we listen, how we respond when things go wrong." The room was now electric with her words, every listener captivated. "But I also want to acknowledge something else," she added, her tone softening. "Moments like these can be opportunities, not just for anger or outrage, but for growth and change. When the airline apologized and launched an investigation, I realized that this could become a teachable moment, not just for them, but for all of us." Miss Jackson's expression grew resolute as she delivered her closing remarks. "I stand here not as a victim, but as a voice for those who feel they've been silenced, ignored, or devalued. To those who've ever felt powerless in the face of disrespect, know this: your voice matters, your dignity matters, and together we can demand better, not just from airlines, but from every space we occupy. She looked out at the audience, her gaze unwavering. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who feel unseen and unheard, and it's about making sure that stops. The room erupted in applause as she stepped back from the podium, her heart racing with a mix of relief and determination. She had delivered her message. She had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a movement for respect and accountability. As she left the stage, Miss Jackson felt something she hadn't felt in days, a sense of control, of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight she was ready to face, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved better. And this was only the beginning. Miss Jackson wasn't sure at first what she wanted to do. She wasn't ready to talk to a legal team just yet. She needed time to process everything, time to think through the kind of action, if any, that felt right. Right now, all she could think about was the overwhelming nature of what had unfolded. The enormity of it all weighed heavily on her mind. As she sat in silence, her representative noticed the exhaustion etched into her face. He spoke gently. "If you'd like, we can have someone speak to you later at your convenience. Of course, we'll respect whatever decision you make." With that, he handed her a card with his contact information and quietly exited the room, leaving her to process everything alone. Miss Jackson stared at the card, her mind racing. Legal teams, follow-up meetings, media inquiries. This was spiraling into something far larger than she had ever imagined. She hadn't come on this flight to start a crusade or to become a spokesperson for anything. But somehow it seemed that's exactly what was happening. And there was no turning back. As the silence lingered, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. She opened it, finding a message from the conference organizers. They had heard about the incident and were offering their support. They assured her that her participation in the conference was still welcome. But they also included an unexpected offer, the chance to speak at the event about her experience. The irony was not lost on her. She had come to the conference to learn, to grow as an educator, not to become the center of a storm. Yet here she was, being asked to share her story with hundreds of people, most of whom didn't know her from a stranger. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, but an undeniable sense of responsibility began to creep in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a larger conversation. She closed her laptop and looked out the window at the bustling airport terminal, and something clicked within her. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The slap, the flight, the media frenzy. They were just the opening chapter of a much bigger narrative. And while she wasn't entirely sure where it would lead, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. The fight for respect, dignity, and accountability was just getting started. And this time, she was going to see it through. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, media inquiries, and messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Miss Jackson had unwittingly found herself at the eye of a media storm, and there was no escaping it. Each time she picked up her phone, there was a new notification, a fresh headline, or a comment to sift through. News outlets were picking up the story in droves, some sensationalizing the incident, others focusing on the deeper issues it raised about customer service, workplace behavior, and the treatment of passengers in the airline industry. At first, the constant barrage of attention made her feel like she was drowning. She was just one person, a teacher caught in the middle of a media frenzy she never asked for. But slowly, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking, strategizing, and realizing the potential of turning this situation into something far more powerful, something that could actually create change. The conference organizers followed up, reiterating their support and offering her a platform to speak. They wanted her to deliver a keynote address about standing up for yourself, demanding respect, and taking action when faced with injustice. She hesitated. The idea of speaking in front of hundreds of people, of sharing such a personal and painful experience, was overwhelming. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this could be her chance to take control of the narrative. She wasn't just a victim, she was a teacher, a leader, a voice that could inspire change. She began writing, pouring out her thoughts and emotions. She wrote about the incident on the plane, about the slap, the confusion, the humiliation. But she also wrote about the aftermath, the disbelief, the crushing sense of being belittled. And then she wrote about the clarity that came with realizing this wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. This was a symptom of something much larger, the way people in power often treat others with disrespect, and the way a single act of violence can shatter someone's dignity. As her words began to take shape, Miss Jackson felt a sense of clarity wash over her. The rage and humiliation were still there, but now they were channeled into something more constructive. She was no longer just telling her story, she was calling for change. Meanwhile, the story continued to unfold in the media. The airline launched an internal investigation, but there was little new information. Passengers who had been on the flight spoke out, their voices adding weight to the growing conversation about the treatment of passengers and the systemic issues within the airline industry. Many questioned whether the stress of the job had contributed to the flight attendant's outburst. But Miss Jackson knew that the story would eventually fade from the headlines. News cycles moved quickly, and soon the incident would become just another viral moment. That's why she knew she had to act. Her message couldn't get lost in the noise. This wasn't just about the slap or the flight. This was about sparking a conversation that had to last beyond the viral video and the trending hashtags. It was about using her voice to create lasting change. Her decision to speak at the conference became a turning point. She would stand before an audience not just as a teacher, but as someone who had experienced something that had shaken her to the core and who had come out stronger because of it. She wasn't just going to share her experience. She was going to advocate for something much bigger, a culture of respect, equality, and accountability, both in the workplace and in our everyday lives. The night before the conference, Miss Jackson sat in her hotel room, reviewing her speech one last time. She wasn't nervous, but she felt the undeniable weight of the moment. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of an audience of educators, professionals, and industry leaders. Some would probably expect her to just talk about the incident, the slap, the humiliation. But Miss Jackson had a bigger message to deliver. She took a deep breath and stood before the mirror, her reflection a reminder of how far she had come. The woman staring back at her was no longer the woman who had boarded that plane. She wasn't the woman who had been slapped and humiliated. She was someone stronger, someone who had turned pain into purpose. The next day, Miss Jackson stood at the podium. Her hands rested on the cool surface, the bright lights shining down on her. The crowd's hum slowly faded, and a sense of calm settled over her. This wasn't just about her story. It was about how we treat each other, especially those who serve us. She glanced out at the audience, seeing a sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, others supportive. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but it was her moment. She began, her voice steady but powerful. Good morning, everyone. I'm here today to talk about an experience I never expected to have. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The audience shifted, leaning in. I was on a plane, just minding my own business. I asked the flight attendant for a simple adjustment to my seat, but instead of kindness, I was dismissed. And when I asked again, she slapped me in front of a plane full of people. The crowd gasped, but Miss Jackson remained composed. She wasn't just telling the story, she was making a point. She wasn't here to demonize the flight attendant, but to start a conversation about how we treat each other, especially those who often go unnoticed. The message resonated. She spoke about the bigger issues at play, how workers in high-pressure, low-paying jobs are often treated with disrespect, and how we, as a society, need to do better. As she finished, the room erupted into applause. But the real victory was what came after, the conversations that would continue beyond the stage. Miss Jackson had ignited something larger than herself. What had begun as a painful, personal experience had blossomed into a movement, one that would continue to grow, ripple outward, and challenge the status quo. In the months that followed, Miss Jackson became a powerful voice for change. Her words had sparked a broader conversation about respect, dignity, and the treatment of workers. She had become a spokesperson not just for passengers, but for those in service jobs, advocating for their rights, mental health, and fair treatment. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Society often overlooks the true humanity of those who serve us. In roles where people are expected to constantly give, whether in customer service, hospitality, or any frontline position, we forget that these workers are human beings. Just like us, they have their struggles, bad days, and frustrations. But this doesn't give anyone the right to treat them as lesser beings. It's a harsh truth that most of us would rather ignore, but it's time we faced it. Emma Jackson felt an immense wave of energy surge through her as she stood before the room, her nerves fading. What had begun as anxiety turned into something far more potent: passion. She had a mission now, to make her story matter, to turn her pain into progress. For those in positions of power, whether you're a manager, a supervisor, or a leader in any capacity, remember this: every person you interact with, from the janitor to the CEO, deserves respect. No job title or station in life justifies making anyone feel invisible or inferior. The flight attendant who had snapped at her might have been having a difficult day, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. We must acknowledge that how we react when we feel powerless is just as important as our actions when we are in control. Jackson paused for a moment, letting her words hang in the air, every eye in the room locked on her. The silence felt heavy, like a collective intake of breath. She knew some were still processing her words, still wrestling with the implications of her experience. But she was resolute. This was bigger than one incident. It was about how we treat each other every single day. "I'm not here to demonize anyone," she said, her voice softening but gaining strength with each word. "I'm not here to place blame, but we need to do better. We need to remember that every single person we encounter, whether they're serving us food, cleaning our rooms, checking us into a hotel, or flying a plane, is a human being, and they deserve the same dignity and respect we expect for ourselves." A moment of silence passed, and then the applause began. It wasn't deafening, but it was real, genuine. Some in the room were wiping tears from their eyes. Jackson's own eyes welled up, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. This was her moment to make a difference. "Let's remember," she said, her voice now steady, filled with quiet strength. "We are all part of this world together. The way we treat each other, not just the people in the seats next to us, but the ones who serve us, the ones who make our lives easier, that matters." The applause grew louder now, a wave of solidarity, and Jackson stood tall, a surge of emotions flooding her: relief, gratitude, pride. She had come into this room unsure of how her words would be received, unsure if they would make a difference. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some deep in thought, she knew this was no longer just her story. It had become something that could spark real change. It was no longer just about a flight or a flight attendant. It was about the way we, as a society, treat one another. She wasn't just a teacher. She was now a voice for those who had been dismissed, ignored, and mistreated. And for the first time in a long time, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the applause faded, Miss Jackson felt the weight of her newfound purpose settle in. This was more than just a viral story. It was the beginning of something bigger, a conversation that needed to happen on a national scale. Days passed, and Jackson began to realize the true impact of her speech. What she had thought would be a small ripple had become a tidal wave of support. Emails flooded her inbox. Social media exploded with messages of encouragement. People from all walks of life, from teachers to service workers, shared their own stories of being mistreated, of feeling invisible. The support was overwhelming, but there were also critics. Some questioned her motives, called her weak for getting emotional, or accused her of turning a small incident into a spectacle. There were even those who justified the flight attendant's actions, suggesting that she must have had a reason for losing her temper. Jackson tried to focus on the positive messages, the ones that came from people who felt seen for the first time. One message stood out: a flight attendant named Maria, with over 15 years of experience in the industry. Maria wrote that she had been following Jackson's story and wanted to reach out. "I'm not defending what happened," Maria said. But I think it's important to understand that many of us in the service industry are under constant stress. We're asked to do more with less, and it takes a toll on our mental and emotional well-being. I've seen incidents like this in my career, and while they're not excusable, they often stem from frustration and burnout. Jackson read the message slowly, contemplating Maria's words. She had been so focused on her own experience that she hadn't considered the pressures flight attendants and other service workers faced. Maria's letter wasn't just an apology, it was an invitation to look at the larger picture. Jackson realized that this wasn't just about the flight attendants' actions, it was about the culture of the airline industry, the unreasonable expectations placed on employees, and the systemic lack of support for those on the front lines. It wasn't just about respect for passengers. It was about the need for better working conditions, better training, and more support for the workers who make the industry function. Inspired, Jackson decided to reach out to Maria. She thanked her for her honesty and acknowledged the importance of addressing worker burnout in high-pressure environments. Maria quickly responded, suggesting they work together to raise awareness about these issues. "Maybe your story can help people see the bigger picture," Maria wrote. This moment was a turning point for Jackson. What she had thought was just about advocating for the dignity of passengers had expanded into a broader campaign for the welfare of all workers, especially those in customer service. She began brainstorming ways she could use her platform to push for better conditions, writing articles, speaking at conferences, and starting conversations about worker wellness, mental health, and the importance of empathy in high-pressure roles. The media frenzy around the incident began to fade, as all viral stories eventually do. But for Jackson, the impact of her message was just beginning. Her story had opened the door to a much larger conversation, one that didn't end when the headlines shifted. The conversations continued in classrooms, workplaces, and homes across the country. Several months after her keynote speech, Jackson began to receive more invitations to speak, not just at education conferences, but also at events focused on workplace wellness and mental health. She had become a spokesperson for a cause far greater than her own. Yet despite the recognition, she remained steadfast in her commitment to the core message: respect, dignity, and support for everyone, regardless of their role or station in life. Miss Jackson had never expected to be in the spotlight, but now that she was, she knew she had a unique opportunity to create real, lasting change. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she was ready to walk it. Because in the end, this wasn't about one viral moment. It was about creating a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect, where no one was treated as less than human. This was the fight worth fighting, and she was ready for it. Let me know in the comments below which one of these enjoyed the video. Remember to leave a like, subscribe, and ring that bell icon so you never miss our upcoming videos. Stay tuned, and we will catch you in the next video. Take care. Thanks for watching.